The void between the stars was never truly empty, a fact that the crew of the long-range scout vessel Uncertainty Principle understood with a clinical, almost religious fervor. Within the pressurized hull of the vessel, the atmosphere was a recycled slurry of nitrogen and oxygen, tasting faintly of ozone and the metallic tang of localized gravity plating. Commander Kalen Thrace sat within the command cradle, his fingers hovering over the hilt of the manual, override as the ship transitioned from the high-energy state of slipstream travel back into the sluggish, predictable reality of three-dimensional space. The transition was always jarring, a sensation akin to being turned inside out through a very narrow straw. Yet the human vestibular system had proven remarkably resilient to the existential dread of folding spacetime. As the shimmer of the forward viewports solidified into the cold, piercing light of a binary star system, the sensors began to scream a discordant melody of warnings and telemetry data that defied the standard parameters of deep space exploration. They were not alone in the gravity well of the primary star, and the signatures appearing on the tactical overlay were not the erratic, natural emissions of drifting asteroids or gas giants. Instead, the screen blossomed with the rigid, geometric heat signatures of artificial structures, massive, interlocking rings that dwarfed the Uncertainty Principle by several orders of magnitude. The structures were silent, yet they thrummed with a residual energy that registered on the ship's long-range spectrometers as a decaying exotic particle field. Thrace felt the hair on the back of his neck rise, a primal mammalian response to the scale of the engineering before him. These were not the works of a fledgling species, they were the monuments of a civilization that viewed planetary bodies as mere building blocks. Beside him, sensor specialist Vane was already working through the encryption layers of the passive signals leaking from the nearest ring. Vane was a man of few words, his mind a labyrinth of mathematics and signal processing, and the way his brow furrowed suggested that the data was not merely complex, but fundamentally alien in its logic. The bridge remained a symphony of soft hums and the occasional click of a cooling vent, the silence between the crew members thick with the realization that they had just stumbled upon the graveyard of a titan. It was a common trope in human fiction, the discovery of the ancient, powerful precursor, but the reality was far more sterile and terrifying. There were no glowing runes, no welcoming beacons, only the cold, unyielding mass of millions of tons of superdense alloys drifting in the dark. As the ship drifted closer, the scale of the devastation became apparent. The rings were not intact, they were shattered, their perimeters jagged where some unimaginable force had sheared through kilometers of armored hull plating. Debris fields the size of small moons orbited the primary star, a chaotic belt of shattered glass, twisted metal, and the frozen remains of whatever atmosphere had once sustained the inhabitants. Thrace ordered a full scan of the nearest intact segment, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He knew that the protocols for first contact were largely academic in the face of a derelict of this magnitude. If whatever had destroyed this civilization was still out there, the Uncertainty Principle was little more than a fleck of dust in a hurricane. Yet, the human drive for understanding, that stubborn refusal to turn back when faced with the unknown, pushed them forward. They began to deploy a series of micro-drones, tiny silver motes, that darted toward the jagged edge of the ring segment, their cameras feeding back a high-resolution stream of a world that had been designed to house billions, now reduced to a hollowed-out shell. The interior of the ring was a nightmare of verticality. Without the centrifugal force of rotation to provide artificial gravity, the structures within the ring were a jumble of multidimensional architecture. Buildings that looked like crystalline growths protruded from every surface, their windows dark and vacant like the eyes of a skull. There were no signs of life, no biosignatures, not even the persistent hum of automated maintenance systems. It was a dead world, a tomb on a galactic scale. Vane tapped a sequence on his console, bringing up a localized energy reading that seemed to be pulsing from deep within the ring's core. It was a faint, rhythmic heartbeat of radiation, a signal that had survived the cataclysm and the eons of drift. It was a beacon, but not one meant for rescuers. It was a localized data dump, a black box recording of a species' final moments. Thrace watched as the translation matrix began to chew through the alien syntax, the computer struggling to find common ground between human linguistic structures and the multi-layered, tonal communication of the builders. As the first fragments of the translation flickered onto the screen, the mood on the bridge shifted from curiosity to a profound, heavy dread. The builders had not been destroyed by an external enemy, nor by a natural disaster. The logs spoke of a great filtration, a philosophical and physical crisis that had gripped their society as they reached the limits of their technological progression. They had built the rings to escape the heat death of their own star system, to create a closed-loop paradise where entropy could be held at bay indefinitely. But the cost of such perfection had been their soul. In their quest for efficiency, they had stripped away the very things that made them a living species, their unpredictability, their capacity for error, and their drive to expand. They had become a static society, a civilization that had reached the end of its story and found that there was nothing left to say. The rings were not a monument to their greatness, but a cage they had built for themselves, and when the systems eventually failed due to sheer lack of interest from their caretakers, the end had been swift and silent. Thrace looked at the jagged edges of the ring again, seeing them now for what they truly were, the scars of a desperate, final attempt by a subset of the population to break free. The destruction had been internal, a civil war fought not over resources or territory, but over the right to be imperfect. The humans on the uncertainty principle sat in a stunned silence, the weight of the revelation pressing down on them. They were a young species, messy and violent and full of contradictions, and here was a mirror of what they might become if they ever truly solved the problems of existence. The Builder civilization had achieved everything humanity currently dreamed of: total energy control, immortality, an end to scarcity, and it had killed them. It was a cautionary tale written in the stars, a warning that the struggle was not just a part of life, but the very essence of it. Thrace felt a sudden, fierce pride in the cramped, utilitarian corridors of his ship and the flawed, weary people who manned it. They were a long way from home, and they were tiny in the grand scheme of things, but they were still moving. The ship's AI chimed, indicating that it had located a localized storage bank within the ring that appeared to be shielded from the vacuum. It was a repository of knowledge, a library of 1 billion years of history and science. If they could retrieve it, humanity would leap forward by millennia. They would have the secrets of zero-point energy, the cure for every ailment, the maps to every corner of the galaxy. It was the ultimate prize, the holy grail of exploration. But Thrace hesitated. He looked at the readings of the Great Filtration again, the way the builders had optimized themselves into extinction. He thought about Earth, with its messy politics and its unfinished wars and its beautiful, chaotic diversity. If he brought this knowledge back, would he be handing his people the keys to the kingdom or the blueprint for their own tomb? The temptation was immense, a physical pull in his chest, but the responsibility was even greater. He was a scout, a pioneer, but he was also a guardian of the human spirit. He looked toward his crew, seeing the same conflict mirrored in their eyes. They were scientists and explorers, and every fiber of their being cried out to take the data, to learn, to grow. But they were also human, and they understood the danger of a gift that hadn't been earned. The conversation that followed was not one of tactics or engineering, but of ethics and the long-term survival of the species. They debated the nature of progress and the necessity of hardship. They spoke of the Goldilocks zone of civilization, the need to be advanced enough to survive, but not so advanced that there was nowhere left to go. It was the most important discussion in the history of the human race, held in a small, pressurized tin can in the shadow of a dead empire. In the end, it was Vane who summarized their collective feeling. If we take the shortcut, we lose the journey. And the journey is all we have. Thrace nodded, the decision crystallizing in his mind. They would not take the full archive. They would take only the warning. They would record the history of the Builders' fall, the lessons learned from their stagnation, and the evidence of their self-destruction. They would leave the secrets of their technology behind, buried in the heart of the shattered rings, to be found perhaps in 1,000,000 years when humanity was ready, or perhaps never at all. He ordered the drones to withdraw, their cameras capturing one last look at the crystalline towers before they turned and headed back to the docking bay. The uncertainty principle began to pull away from the gravity well, its engines glowing with a fierce, defiant light. As they prepared for the return jump, Thrace looked out at the binary stars, their light reflecting off the hull of his ship. They were leaving behind the greatest treasure in the galaxy, and in doing so, they were ensuring their own future. The jump back into Slipstream was just as violent as the arrival, but this time, the sensation of being stretched and compressed felt different. It felt like growth. As the ship hurtled through the non-space between points A and B, Thrace began to draft his report to the unified command back on Earth. He knew it would be met with skepticism, perhaps even anger. There would be those who would call him a coward, a man who had blinked when faced with the infinite. But he also knew that there would be others who understood. He would tell them of the rings and the silence and the cost of perfection. He would tell them that humanity's strength lay not in what they possessed, but in what they were willing to work for. The report would be long, filled with data and philosophical musings, but its core message would be simple. The stars are not ours to conquer, but to experience. As the unbiological principle re-entered the solar system weeks later, the blue marble of Earth looked more precious than ever. It was a planet of oceans and clouds, of storms and sunlight, a place where nothing was permanent and everything was in a state of flux. It was a world that was still very much alive, still struggling, still evolving. Thrace stood on the bridge as the ship approached the orbital station, the lights of the cities below twinkling like a carpet of fallen stars. He thought of the builders, frozen in their perfect dead rings, and then he looked at the messy, vibrant world below. He took a deep breath, the air of the station finally tasting of something other than recycled metal. They were home, and they were still flawed, and they were still human. And that, he realized, was the greatest victory of all. He tapped the comms, his voice echoing through the ship for one last time before they docked. "Mission accomplished," he said, and for the first time in months, he smiled. The data they brought back changed the world, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of a technological revolution, it sparked a cultural and philosophical renaissance. The lesson of the rings became a fundamental part of the human curriculum, a reminder that the path to the future was paved with the challenges of the present. People began to look at progress differently, valuing sustainability and resilience over raw expansion. The drive to reach the stars remained, but it was tempered by a new understanding of what it meant to be a successful civilization. Humanity did not stop growing, they simply stopped trying to find the end of the road. They realized that the destination was an illusion, and that the only thing that truly mattered was the way they walked the path. Years later, when Thrace was an old man, he would often sit on the balcony of his home overlooking the Pacific Ocean and look up at the night sky. He would think of the binary system, the shattered rings, and the silent library he had left behind. He never regretted his decision. He saw the way humanity had adapted, the way they had taken the warning to heart and built a society that was more robust, more empathetic, and more alive than anything the builders could have imagined. They were still exploring, still pushing the boundaries of what was possible, but they were doing it on their own terms, at their own pace. They were no longer afraid of the dark because they had learned to carry their own light. And as the stars began to come out, one by one, he knew that the journey was only just beginning. The universe was vast, and there was so much more to see, so many more mistakes to make, and so many more lessons to learn. And he wouldn't have it any other way. The transition from a pioneer to a statesman was not a path Kalen Thrace had ever intended to tread, yet the weight of the Ring archive, even in its absence, had forged a new role for him within the halls of the Terran High Council. The council chambers, a vast amphitheater of basalt and reinforced glass overlooking the reclaimed greenery of the Geneva Basin, felt far more claustrophobic than the bridge of a scout ship. Here, the vacuum was replaced by the suffocating density of political maneuvering and the relentless questioning of the Science Directorate. Before him sat 5 ministers, their faces illuminated by the soft blue glow of data streams that summarized the Threshold Report, the official documentation of why humanity's greatest discovery had been left to rot in a binary star system. Minister Vesper, a woman whose lineage traced back to the lunar colonies and whose eyes held the cold pragmatism of a vacuum-born survivor, leaned forward, her fingers steepled. She did not ask about the beauty of the rings or the tragedy of the builders. She asked about the energy equations, the propulsion physics, and the specific structural integrity of the materials described in the fragmentary logs they had brought back. The atmosphere in the room was thick with the scent of sterile air and the unspoken resentment of an entire scientific community that felt it had been robbed of its birthright. Thrace stood his ground, his uniform crisp but his posture relaxed, a deliberate contrast to the rigid tension of the ministers. He explained, not for the first time, that the builders had not lacked for energy or material, they had lacked for meaning. He spoke of the entropy of the spirit, a concept that the Directorate found frustratingly unquantifiable. To the ministers, the idea that a civilization could die from solving existence was a philosophical ghost story, not a basis for interstellar policy. Yet the telemetry logs were undeniable. The sensors had recorded the decay of a society that had automated its own soul, and as the footage of the shattered rings played on the central hololith, even the most cynical bureaucrats found themselves momentarily silenced by the sheer scale of the failure. The debate shifted from the why to the what now. If humanity was to avoid the fate of the ring builders, the current trajectory of centralized, hyper-efficient expansion had to be re-evaluated. This was the true core of the conflict. The Council had spent decades perfecting a unified model of human governance, a system designed to minimize waste and maximize output. Thrace and his supporters were now arguing for the introduction of intentional friction, the preservation of local cultures, the decentralization of critical infrastructure, and the protection of the unpredictable elements of human nature. They were arguing for the very things the Council had been designed to smooth over. It was a radical shift in perspective, one that viewed the messiness of Earth not as a problem to be solved, but as a biological safeguard against the stagnation that had claimed the builders. Outside the chambers, the world was already changing. The news of the discovery had leaked, as all things do, and the public reaction was a chaotic blend of awe and existential terror. The ring warning had become a cultural touchstone, sparking a global conversation about the limits of technology and the value of human effort. On the streets of the great megacities, people were looking up at the sky with a new sense of perspective. The drive for a perfect society was being replaced by a drive for a resilient one. This wasn't a rejection of technology, but a refinement of its purpose. The goal was no longer to eliminate every hardship, but to ensure that the hardships we faced were ones that made us stronger, rather than ones that simply ground us down. This was the architecture of resilience that Thrace had begun to advocate for, a society built like a complex ecosystem rather than a monolithic machine. In the laboratories of the Mars shipyards, the shift was even more pronounced. Engineers who had once been focused on creating the fastest, most efficient engines were now looking into modular designs that could be repaired with local materials. The focus moved from perfect systems that required a vast industrial tail to robust systems that could survive in isolation. This was a direct response to the fragility index found in the Builder archives, a mathematical proof that as a system becomes more optimized, it becomes more vulnerable to unforeseen shocks. Humanity was learning that a ship that could be fixed by its crew with a soldering iron and a prayer was, in the long run, more valuable than one that required a specialized dry dock 6 light-years away. It was a return to the ethos of the early explorers, a recognition that self-reliance was the ultimate survival trait. The Council eventually reached a tenuous compromise, spearheaded by Vespa herself, who had found a cold logic in Thrace's warnings. They would not ban the pursuit of advanced technology, but they would implement the inertia protocols. For every major leap in automation or energy production, there would be a mandatory period of social and ecological assessment. More importantly, the Council would fund divergence projects, colonies on distant worlds that were encouraged to develop their own unique social structures, technologies, and cultures, even if they were less efficient than the Terran standard. These colonies would act as the genetic diversity of the human race, ensuring that if one path led to a dead end, there would be others still moving in different directions. It was an expensive, inefficient, and utterly human solution to a galactic-scale problem. Thrace watched from the shuttle window as he departed Geneva for the orbital platforms. He was no longer a commander of a single ship, but a consultant for a multi-generational strategy. He thought of the builders and their perfect, silent rings, and then he looked at the flashing lights of the shuttle's control panel, which flickered occasionally with a minor, harmless glitch. He found himself smiling at the imperfection. He knew that some people would always crave the absolute, the final answer, the end of the struggle. But as long as there were ships, like the uncertainty principle, and people willing to look into the dark and say, "Not today," humanity would avoid the trap of the rings. They were building a future that was not a destination, but a process, a bridge that they were constructing even as they walked across it. The second chapter of the human story among the stars was not one of conquest, but of intentional wandering. New missions were being prepared, not to find more archives or ancient weapons, but to find new ways to be human. The lesson of the rings had become a compass, pointing not toward a specific star, but away from the stagnation of the center. Thrace knew that his time as a key player in this drama was limited by the simple reality of his age, but he felt a profound sense of peace. He had seen the end of the road and had helped his people choose a different path. The stars were still there, vast and indifferent, but for the first time in history, humanity was looking at them not as a puzzle to be solved, but as an infinite canvas for their own beautiful, chaotic, and enduringly flawed existence. As the shuttle docked with the Mars-bound transport, Thrace checked the latest telemetry from the frontier colonies. One group on a high-gravity world was experimenting with biological engineering to adapt their own bodies, while another on a frozen moon was reviving ancient, low-tech thermal management systems. They were different, they were struggling, and they were thriving. This was the legacy he had hoped for. The Great Filtration was not a wall to be climbed, but a filter to be passed through by remaining fluid, adaptable, and persistently unfinished. He walked through the airlock, the familiar smell of recycled air and machine oil greeting him like an old friend. There was work to be done, more questions to be asked, and a whole universe of mistakes still left to make. And for Kalen Thrace, that was exactly how it should be. The third major divergence initiative took root on a planet designated as Selam 4, a world where the gravity was a punishing 20% higher than the Terran baseline, and the atmosphere was thick enough to carry the scent of wet stone and crushed ferns across vast, iron-rich plains. Unlike the sleek, streamlined colonies of the inner systems, Selam 4 was designed as a sanctuary of kinetic effort, a place where the inertia protocols were not just a legal guideline, but a physical reality. The settlers here had signed a charter that explicitly forbade the use of generalized artificial intelligence and self-repairing nanomachines, choosing instead a life of mechanical complexity and manual intervention. The primary settlement, New Gearbridge, was a testament to this philosophy, a sprawling cityscape of brass, tempered steel, and heavy-duty hydraulics that rose like a jagged mountain range against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. Here, the hum of the city was not the silent vibration of solid-state electronics, but the rhythmic thumping of massive steam-driven pistons and the grinding of gargantuan gears that regulated the planet's geothermal taps. Thrace, now serving as a senior advisor for the Colonial Oversight Bureau, stood on the observation deck of the colony's central spire, feeling the constant, low-frequency tremor of the city beneath his boots. It was a visceral reminder of the human cost of existence that the ring builders had forgotten. To his left stood Overseer Aris Thorne, a man whose skin was etched with the scars of a dozen industrial accidents and whose eyes possessed the sharp, uncompromising clarity of a master watchmaker. Thorne did not believe in the luxury of ease. He believed in the dignity of the struggle. He pointed toward the southern horizon, where a massive construction project was underway, a series of atmospheric scrubbers that relied on physical centrifugal force rather than chemical catalysts to clean the air. It was slower, louder, and far more demanding of human labor, but it was also entirely transparent. If a gear broke, a person fixed it. If the system failed, it was because of a tangible, understandable error, not an unfathomable glitch in a million lines of autonomous code. The social structure of New Gearbridge had evolved to mirror its machinery. It was a meritocracy of skill, a society where the highest status was reserved not for those who owned the most, but for those who could maintain the most. This maintenance ethos was the colony's primary defense against the stagnation Thrace had witnessed in the rings. By tethering their survival to their own physical and mental labor, the people of Selam 4 had created a culture that was perpetually engaged with its environment. There were no end users here, only operators. Even the children spent their afternoons in the apprentice bays, learning the geometry of leverage and the chemistry of metallurgy. It was a grueling way to live, and yet, as Thrace walked the streets, he saw a vitality that was often missing in the hypermanaged domes of Mars or the sterile luxury of the orbital habitats. There was a noise here, a clamor of voices and metal that felt like the pulse of a living thing. However, the divergence was not without its critics. Back on Earth, the efficiency bloc argued that Selam 4 was a romanticized regression, a dangerous waste of resources that could be better utilized by automated harvesters. They pointed to the injury rates and the lower life expectancy compared to the core worlds as evidence of a failed experiment. Thrace, however, saw the data differently. While the physical toll was higher, the markers for psychological resilience and social cohesion were off the charts. The people of Selam 4 did not suffer from the ennui of plenty that had plagued the builders. They did not have the time or the inclination to succumb to the philosophical despair of a finished world. Their challenges were immediate, physical, and solvable. They were, in the most literal sense, the architects of their own survival, and that gave them a sense of purpose that no automated utopia could ever provide. The tension between the core and the divergence projects came to a head when a massive solar flare from Selam's primary star threatened to knock out the colony's primary geothermal regulators. In a standard colony, an AI would have calculated the surge and adjusted the shielding in nanoseconds. In New Gearbridge, The solution required hundreds of people to manually vent high-pressure steam through a series of emergency bypasses, a task that was as dangerous as it was essential. Thrace watched from the control room as teams of engineers, draped in heavy heat shields, descended into the guts of the city. There was no margin for error, and the communication was a frantic exchange of shouted coordinates and mechanical readings. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated human agency. They weren't waiting for a machine to save them. They were saving themselves through sheer collective will and a deep understanding of the machines they had built with their own hands. As the flare passed and the pressure gauges returned to the green, a roar of triumph echoed through the steam tunnels, a sound so primal and raw that it vibrated in Thrace's very bones. He realized then that this was the missing variable in the builders' equations. The builders had optimized for safety, and in doing so, they had eliminated the possibility of courage. They had optimized for comfort, and in doing so, they had eliminated the necessity of triumph. The people of New Gearbridge were exhausted, covered in soot, and several were being treated for burns, but they were more alive in that moment than any of the trillion souls who had faded away in the silent perfection of the rings. They had looked at the cold indifference of the universe and forced it to yield through the application of their own sweat and ingenuity. Thrace's report to the High Council was uncharacteristically blunt. He stated that the inefficiency of Selam 4 was its greatest asset. He argued that the vulnerability of the colony was what made its success meaningful. The inertia protocols were working not because they made life better in a material sense, but because they made life more significant. He proposed that the model of New Gearbridge be expanded, not as a replacement for high technology, but as a necessary counterbalance. Humanity needed the sleek, fast ships of the Scout Corps, but it also needed the heavy, grinding gears of the frontier. It needed the contrast between the ease of the center and the effort of the edge to maintain its perspective. The Council, moved by the footage of the manual venting and the raw emotion of the settlers, begrudgingly agreed to continue the funding for the divergence projects. The nights on Selam 4 were long, the thick atmosphere trapping the heat of the day and releasing it slowly. Thrace sat on a balcony overlooking the main gear plaza, watching as the maintenance crews began their nightly rounds, their lanterns swinging in the dark like low-flying stars. He thought about his own journey, from the silent graveyard of a dead empire to this noisy, messy, thriving world of iron and steam. He realized that the Great Filtration wasn't a single event, but a constant pressure, a tide that was always trying to pull a civilization toward the path of least resistance. To survive, a species had to be willing to swim against that tide, to choose the difficult path simply because it was the one that required them to keep moving. He took a sip of the local cider, which was tart and fermented in oak barrels, another small inefficiency that tasted better than any synthesized nutrient slurry. As he prepared to board the shuttle back to the core systems, Overseer Thorn met him at the landing pad. The two men didn't say much. They didn't need to. They were both veterans of different kinds of wars. One fought against the vastness of space, the other against the seductive pull of stagnation. Thorn handed Thrace a small, heavy object, a hand-forged gear made of Selam steel, its teeth polished to a mirror finish. A reminder, Thorn said, his voice gravelly from years of shouting over the steam. A reminder that the universe doesn't give us anything for free. We have to earn every second of our existence. Thrace took the gear, its weight solid and reassuring in his palm. It was a far cry from the delicate, impossible technology of the builders, and that was exactly why it was beautiful. The shuttle lifted off, its chemical engines roaring as they fought the heavy gravity of the world below. Thrace looked down at New Gearbridge, a glowing ember of human defiance in the vast, purple dark of the plains. He knew that the debate would continue, that the efficiency block would never stop pushing for more automation, more control, more perfection. But he also knew that as long as there were places like Selam 4, places where people chose the gear over the code and the sweat over the simulation, the human spirit would remain unfilterable. They were building a future that was anchored in the past, a bridge made of iron and hope that spanned the gap between who they were and who they might become. And as the shuttle cleared the atmosphere and the stars came into view, Thrace felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey was long, the road was hard, and the destination was nowhere in sight. It was, he decided, the perfect place to be. While the heavy iron of Selam 4 ground against the friction of the physical world, another divergence project took root on the far edge of the Perseus Arm, on a world named Verdance. This planet was a riotous explosion of biological complexity, a place where the distinction between flora and fauna was blurred by a pervasive, planetary-scale network of fungal mycelia and bioluminescent spores. The settlers of Verdance had not brought the heavy hammers of the industrial age. Instead, they had arrived with the precision of geneticists and the humility of gardeners. Their goal was the ultimate divergence, the integration of human biology with a local ecosystem. They sought to prove that resilience did not just come from fighting the environment, but from becoming a part of it. This was the Green Path, a social experiment that pushed the boundaries of what it meant to be human to the very breaking point of the species' genetic code. Commander Thrace, now a man whose hair was the color of lunar dust, arrived at Verdance not as an overseer, but as a witness. The landing craft touched down on a platform of living, woven wood that grew directly from the canopy of a forest, whose trees reached heights that defied the standard laws of structural botany. There was no smell of machine oil here, only the overwhelming, heady scent of damp earth, blooming nightshades, and a faint, sweet musk that seemed to vibrate in the back of the throat. The welcoming party did not wear uniforms. They wore garments made of a translucent, silk-like material grown from the secretions of local larvae, and their skin was etched with swirling patterns of symbiotic algae that shifted in color based on their emotional state and the intensity of the overhead sun. The leader of the Verdance Collective was a person named Surin, whose eyes possessed a terrifying depth, reflecting a consciousness that was no longer entirely solitary. Surin explained that the people of Verdance had moved beyond the command and control model of planetary habitation. They did not build houses, they shaped the growth of massive, hollowed-out gourds that served as living habitats. They did not mine for minerals, they cultivated deep-rooting organisms that concentrated rare earth elements in their fruit. This was not a regression to a primitive state, but a hyper-advanced application of biological engineering. They had replaced the silicon chip with the neural knot and the copper wire with the electrochemical pulse of the forest floor. It was a civilization that hummed with the quiet, relentless energy of 1 trillion growing cells. Thrace was led through the neural grove, a place where the settlers could literally plug their own nervous systems into the planetary network. By using a series of non-invasive, bioorganic interfaces, they could share sensory data, memories, and even emotions with the ecosystem and each other. It was a collective consciousness that was not forced by a central AI, but emerged naturally from the shared experience of the world. Surin demonstrated this by touching a large, pulsating node on a nearby trunk. As they did, the entire grove began to glow with a soft, amber light, mirroring Surin's internal state of calm. This was the symbiotic horizon, a state of existence where the individual was never truly alone, yet never fully lost. It was the biological answer to the isolation of the ring builders, a way to ensure that the species never reached a static end, because the world they were part of was always evolving, always reacting, always alive. However, the Green Path carried its own set of existential risks. The Council back on Earth feared that the people of Verdance were losing their humanity in the most literal sense. There were reports of settlers losing the ability to speak, preferring the silent, high-bandwidth communication of the mycelial network. There were concerns about the long-term stability of a society that was so deeply entwined with a single planet's biosphere. If Verdance suffered a global blight or a geological catastrophe, the people would have no exterior to retreat to. They were putting all their evolutionary eggs in one very complex, very green basket. Thrace watched the settlers, noticing the way they moved with a feline grace, their movements perfectly synchronized with the swaying of the branches and the pulse of the light. They were beautiful, but they were becoming something else. They were becoming a new branch on the tree of life, one that might eventually break away from the human trunk entirely. The tension reached a tipping point when the Council issued a directive demanding that the Verdance Collective maintain a technological anchor, a hardened facility of traditional human electronics and satellite communication to ensure they remained compatible with the rest of the species. Surin and the collective refused. They argued that the anchor was a form of distrust, a mechanical shackle that would prevent them from fully reaching the next stage of their development. They viewed the reliance on external tools as a sign of a severed species, a primitive way of interacting with the universe. To them, the human body was not a fixed vessel, but a starting point for an infinite journey of adaptation. They didn't want to use tools, they wanted to be the tool. Thrace spent his nights in a living room that breathed, the walls expanding and contracting in a slow, rhythmic cycle. He thought about the builders and their rings. They had chosen the path of the machine, the path of total control over the external world, and it had led them to a dead end. The people of Verdance were choosing the path of the organism, the path of total integration with the internal world. Was this the answer, or was it just another kind of trap? If you become one with the forest, do you still have the drive to reach for the stars? He realized that the great filtration could happen through bliss just as easily as through stagnation. If life becomes too harmonious, the friction that drives progress might vanish, leaving the species as a beautiful, static ornament on a single planet. During a storm that lashed the canopy with violet lightning and rain that tasted of minerals, Thrace spoke with a young settler named Jorah. Jorah had been born on Verdance and had never seen the grey steel of a spaceship or the cold vacuum of the void. Jorah's skin was a deep, earthy green, and their fingers were long and exceptionally dexterous, designed for the intricate work of pruning the neural nodes. Thrace asked Jorah if they ever felt the urge to leave, to see the worlds of iron or the cities of the core. Jorah looked at him with a gentle, puzzling smile. "Why would I want to be a fragment?" Jorah asked, "when I can be part of the whole? Out there, you are just a point of light in the dark. Here, I am the rain, the root, and the thunder." It was a perspective that was both profoundly peaceful and utterly alien to the human tradition of the lonely, defiant pioneer. In his final report for this leg of his journey, Thrace wrote about the biological dilemma. He acknowledged that Verdance had solved many of the problems of the builders. There was no ennui here, no lack of meaning, for every breath was a contribution to the whole. But he also warned that the collective might be sacrificing the very thing that had allowed humanity to survive the long journey from the African savanna to the stars, the restless, dissatisfied individual. He recommended that the Council allow Verdance to continue its path, but insisted that they remain a closed system experiment. The green path was a valid way to be alive, but it could not be the only way. Humanity's strength, he realized, lay in its fragmentation. It lay in the fact that on one world, people were building steam engines with their bare hands, while on another, they were dreaming the dreams of a forest. As the shuttle broke the atmosphere of Verdance, Thrace looked down at the swirling patterns of green and gold. He felt a pang of sadness, a sense of loss for a piece he would never truly know. But as he looked out at the cold, hard stars, he felt a familiar surge of adrenaline. The shuttle was a metal box, a fragile bubble of air in a hostile universe, and yet it was his home. He belonged to the species that wasn't satisfied with being the rain or the root. He belonged to the species that wanted to know why the rain fell and where the stars went. He touched the small iron gear in his pocket, the gift from Selim 4, and felt the comforting weight of its resistance. The journey continued, not because they had found the right way to live, but because they were still brave enough to try all the wrong ones. The fourth chapter of the human expansion was defined by this realization, that the human was not a fixed point, but a spectrum. From the iron-willed mechanics of the high-gravity worlds to the bioluminescent dreamers of the forest moons, the species was spreading its bets across the galaxy. They were creating a tapestry of existence so complex and so varied that no single filtration event could ever hope to catch them all. They were building a future that was redundant, inefficient, and wildly unpredictable. And in the vast, silent halls of the dead ring builders, the ghosts of a perfect civilization watched, if ghosts could watch, as a messy, loud, and brilliantly diverse successor raced past them into the unknown. Thrace leaned back in his seat, the vibrations of the engines a steady heartbeat in the dark. The peace of the fragmented human expansion was shattered not by a failure of their own design, but by a signal that arrived with the terrifying clarity of a laser through a lens. It originated from the Epsilon Eridani cluster, a region of space that had long been obscured by dense nebular clouds and high-intensity stellar winds. The signal was not a greeting, nor was it a warning. It was a mathematical proof of human inferiority. The senders identified themselves as the Vindicated, a species that had survived their own version of the Great Filtration by embracing a philosophy of absolute, unyielding structural purity. To the Vindicated, the diverse and messy path humanity had chosen, the iron gears of Selim 4, the biological drift of Verdance, and the chaotic politics of Earth, was a cosmic cancer, a chaotic noise that threatened the underlying harmony of the universe. They did not seek to conquer, they sought to resolve. Thrace, now an elder statesman whose influence spanned the colonies, was summoned to the high-security bunker beneath the crust of the moon. There, the Science Directorate and the Unified Command played back the Vindicated's transmission. It was a visual data stream of chilling precision. The Vindicated vessels were not ships in any traditional sense. They were geometric abstractions, perfect spheres and tetrahedrons of white-hot plasma and stabilized gravity. They did not use engines. They seemed to slide through the fabric of space by manipulating the very laws of physics that humanity was still struggling to map. The footage showed the destruction of a minor automated mining outpost on the edge of the Uat cloud. There was no explosion, no debris. The outpost simply ceased to exist, its atoms reorganized into a cloud of inert, perfectly uniform hydrogen gas. It was the ultimate expression of the builder's philosophy, taken to its most aggressive, externalized extreme. The Vindicated's mandate was simple. The universe was a closed system with a finite capacity for order. Every imperfection, every biological deviation, and every unnecessary complexity increased the total entropy of the cosmos. To save the universe from heat death, the Vindicated believed they had a divine, mathematical duty to simplify it. They were the cleaners of the stars, the cosmic janitors come to sweep away the dust of humanity. The threat was unlike anything the species had ever faced. It wasn't a war over resources, territory, or even ideology. It was a war over the right to be complex. For the first time in generations, the fragmented branches of the human family were forced to look at one another not as experiments, but as a single, threatened whole. The response from the core worlds was predictable, a massive mobilization of the automated defense fleets and the activation of high-yield energy weapons. But Thrace knew, with a sinking feeling in his chest, that the core's weapons were based on the same logic as the Vindicated's technology. They were fighting for order with order, and in a contest of pure mathematical efficiency, the Vindicated were millennia ahead. He turned his attention instead to the divergence projects. If the Vindicated were looking for predictable patterns to resolve, then the most unpredictable elements of humanity were their only hope. He sent out a high-priority, encrypted burst to New Gearbridge and Verdance. He didn't ask for soldiers or weapons, he asked for their chaos. The defense of the Sol system began at the orbit of Saturn. The Vindicated sphere, a massive orb of white light several kilometers in diameter, arrived with a silent, terrifying grace. The Terran fleet, a wall of the most advanced railguns and laser arrays ever built, opened fire. The barrage was enough to crack a small moon, but the Vindicated sphere didn't even flicker. It simply absorbed the kinetic energy, converted it into a localized gravitational pulse, and watched as the lead Terran cruisers were compressed into metallic pancakes by their own mass. The perfect technology of the core was being turned against itself. The Vindicated were using the very laws of the universe as their weapon, and the human fleet was playing a game of checkers against a master of multi-dimensional chess. It was then that the first of the divergence reinforcements arrived. From the direction of Selam 4 came a fleet of battering rams, massive, ugly blocks of lead and iron, propelled by crude, high-velocity chemical explosions. They were devoid of advanced electronics, guided by manual optical sights and the steady hands of pilots who lived by the rule of the gear. When the Vindicated tried to hack their systems or manipulate their energy fields, there was nothing to grab onto. The battering rams were too simple, too noisy, and too physically dense to be easily resolved. They were a literal wrench in the cosmic machinery. One of the iron ships, the Willful Ignorance, managed to close the distance, its pilot igniting a massive, low-tech shaped charge that physically dented the perfect surface of the sphere. For the first time, the Vindicated signal flickered. At the same moment, the green cloud from Verdance arrived. It wasn't a fleet, but a swarm of trillions of bioengineered spores, carried by solar sail organisms that resembled giant, translucent jellyfish. These spores didn't attack the Vindicated sphere with heat or light, they attacked it with life. They were designed to feed on the specific radiation frequencies the Vindicated used for their gravity shields. The spores landed on the sphere and began to grow, their roots digging into the microfractures of the plasma casing, converting the high-order energy of the Vindicated into the messy, unpredictable chemical energy of growth. The sphere began to look less like a geometric abstraction and more like a moss-covered stone. The purity of the Vindicated was being contaminated by the sheer, relentless hunger of a biological system. Thrace watched the battle from the lunar bunker, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw the Vindicated sphere struggle to adapt. Its logic gates were being flooded with the noise of manual iron and the entropy of organic life. It couldn't calculate a resolution because the inputs were constantly changing, driven by the individual choices of human pilots and the erratic mutations of the verdant spores. The Vindicated were designed to fight a civilization that had reached its peak, a civilization that was static and predictable. They didn't know how to fight a species that was intentionally moving in a dozen different directions at once. The imperfection of humanity was not their weakness, it was their primary defense. The climax of the engagement occurred when a group of New Gearbridge engineers, led by a descendant of Overseer Thorn, managed to board the Vindicated sphere through one of the breaches created by the iron rams. They didn't bring high-tech hacking rigs, they brought sledgehammers and thermite. They moved through the corridors of pure light, their heavy boots cracking the pristine surfaces, their very presence a biological insult to the Vindicated sanctuary. When they reached the central core, a pulsing knot of hyperdense data, they didn't try to download it. They simply jammed a literal iron bar into the primary cooling vent and set off a series of chemical explosives. The resulting explosion was small, messy, and entirely non-mathematical. The Vindicated sphere didn't detonate in a grand fireball. It simply lost its coherence. The white light faded, the gravity shields collapsed, and the perfect geometry sagged into a lumpy, misshapen mass of exotic matter that began to drift toward the gravity well of Saturn. The vindicated signal, which had been so arrogant and clear, dissolved into a scream of digital agony before falling silent. They had been defeated not by a superior force, but by a more resilient one. They had been unresolved by the very chaos they had sought to eliminate. The remaining vindicated vessels in the cluster, sensing the failure of their primary logic, retreated back into the nebula, their perfect shapes shimmering with a newfound hint of hesitation. The aftermath of the battle was a period of profound reflection. The core worlds realized that their survival had depended entirely on the inefficient brothers and sisters they had once looked down upon. The divergence projects were no longer seen as social experiments, but as the essential defense in depth of the human race. The Council was reorganized into the Accord of Variations, a governing body that recognized the necessity of multiple, even contradictory, paths of development. Thrace, in his final act as a public figure, helped draft the Tapestry Charter, which forbade any single human faction from ever imposing its way of life on another. The strength of the species was officially codified as its diversity. As the sun rose over the lunar horizon, casting long, stark shadows across the craters, Thrace walked out onto the observation deck. He looked toward Earth, then toward the distant, invisible points in the sky where his friends and allies were rebuilding their iron cities and their living forests. He thought of the ring builders, who had chosen one path and followed it to the end. He thought of the vindicated, who had chosen one truth and tried to force it on the stars. And then he thought of humanity, a species that was too stubborn to pick a side, too curious to stop moving, and too messy to ever be perfect. He felt a deep, abiding warmth in his chest. They had passed the greatest filter of all, the temptation to be one thing. The fifth chapter of their story ended not with a victory parade, but with a quiet return to work. There were ships to repair, forests to prune, and a whole galaxy of new imperfections to discover. The vindicated were still out there, as were the ghosts of the builders, and 1,000 other threats they couldn't even imagine yet. But for the first time, humanity wasn't afraid. They knew that as long as they kept changing, as long as they kept diverging, and as long as they kept valuing the weight of the feather as much as the strength of the gear, they would always find a way through the dark. Thrace closed his eyes, the light of the sun warm on his face, and listened to the hum of the lunar bass, the rhythmic, beautiful, and endlessly variable sound of people simply being alive. The final era of Kaelin Thrace's life was spent not in the halls of power, but in a small, self-sustaining observatory on the outer rim of the Uit cloud, a place where the light of the sun was little more than a particularly bright star. He had lived long enough to see the Accord of Variations become the bedrock of human civilization, watching as the species blossomed into 1,000 different forms, some barely recognizable as human, yet all tethered by the shared history of their origin. The technology of the core had merged with the mechanical grit of the high-gravity worlds and the biological fluidity of the forest moons, creating a culture that was a patchwork of contradictions. It was here, in the cold silence of the fringe, that the final piece of the puzzle began to move. A signal, ancient and heavily compressed, began to bleed through the background radiation of the galactic center, directed specifically at the coordinates where the uncertainty principle had first discovered the shattered rings centuries prior. Thrace, now existing in a body heavily augmented by Verdant-style longevity grafts and coelom-built prosthetic joints, was the first to receive the transmission. It was not a message of war like the Vindicated, nor a library of data like the Archive. It was a summons. The architects are wakeful, the signal whispered in a linguistic structure that felt like a long-forgotten memory. The original builders, the ones who had constructed the rings, and then vanished into the deep shadows of the cosmic web, had not all faded away. A small contingent had placed themselves into a state of recursive hibernation, waiting for a successor species to either fail as they had or to prove that the great filtration could be overcome. They were calling for a representative, and the Accord of Variations knew there was only one choice. Thrace was ferried to the center of the galaxy aboard the Resonance, a ship that was itself a hybrid of living tissue and forged iron. The meeting point was a world that did not exist on any star chart, a planet-sized computer made of cold, dark matter orbiting a black hole that had been tamed into a stable energy source. As Thrace's shuttle descended, he saw no buildings, no rings, and no machines. The surface was a smooth, obsidian-like material that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light. When he stepped out of the airlock, he was met by a figure that was both solid and translucent, a shimmering tapestry of light and shadow that held the vague shape of a bipedal form. This was the last architect, a being that had stripped away the physical and the digital to become a creature of pure information. There was no sound in the thin, artificial atmosphere, but the architect's thoughts echoed in Thrace's mind with the weight of eons. The architect revealed that the rings had been a test, a mirror designed to reflect the ultimate fate of any civilization that sought a final answer. They had watched humanity's discovery of the archive, watched Thrace's decision to leave the secrets behind, and watched the subsequent divergence of the species. We believed that the only end to the journey was the wall of perfection, the architect communicated, the thought tinged with a melancholy that transcended time. We built the rings to be a paradise, and they became a tomb. We expected you to follow us into the silence, to take our knowledge and build your own cages. Instead, you chose to remain broken. You chose to remain unfinished. Why? Thrace looked at the architect, his old eyes reflecting the swirling light of the black hole's accretion disk. He didn't answer with a speech or a mathematical proof. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, heavy iron gear from Coelum 4, now worn smooth by years of handling. He placed the gear on the obsidian surface. Because we realized that the gear only works if there is a gap between the teeth, Thrace said, his voice raspy but firm. If the fit is perfect, it cannot turn. If the system is complete, it cannot grow. We didn't choose to be broken, we chose to be functional. We learned that the struggle isn't a flaw in the design, it is the design itself. The architect was silent for a long time, the light within its form swirling in complex, agitated patterns. It reached out a shimmering hand and touched the iron gear. The physical contact between the ancient, hyper-advanced being and the crude piece of human labor seemed to send a ripple through the very fabric of the dark matter world. For the first time in a million years, the architect experienced the sensation of friction, the cold, hard reality of a thing that had been earned through effort rather than conjured by thought. The architect admitted that their species had reached the end of history because they had solved every problem except for the problem of existence itself. They had forgotten that life is a kinetic process, not a static state. By observing humanity, the builders had seen a different path, a path of perpetual becoming. The Vindicated, they explained, were a failed experiment of the builders, a splinter group that had mistaken the quest for order for the goal of existence. Humanity's victory over the Vindicated had been the final proof the architects needed. They were not the masters of the galaxy come to reclaim their throne. They were the students, and humanity, in all its messy, loud, and contradictory glory, was the teacher. The architect began to fade, its form dissolving back into the background radiation of the dark matter world, but its final thought was a gift. The universe is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a song that never ends. Keep singing. As the architect vanished, the obsidian world began to change. The dark matter structures started to break apart, reconfiguring themselves into a massive, shimmering gateway, not a gate to another place, but a gate to a new kind of understanding. The knowledge of the builders was finally being offered, but not as a shortcut to perfection. It was being offered as a set of tools for the journey, a way to navigate the deeper mysteries of the multiverse without losing the human spark. Thrace stood alone on the dissolving surface, the iron gear back in his hand. He felt a profound sense of closure, not for the human story, but for the first era of it. They had survived the great filtration not by being the strongest or the smartest, but by being the most persistent in their refusal to be finished. Thrace returned to the Resonance, where the crew, a mix of core-born scientists, Selam engineers, and Verdant-slinked navigators, awaited him. He told them what he had seen and what the architect had said. The news spread through the Accord of Variations like a wildfire, but this time there was no panic, no frantic rush for power. There was only a quiet, determined sense of purpose. The lesson of the rings had evolved into the mandate of the journey. Humanity was no longer a species trying to find its way in a hostile universe. They were the guardians of the idea that life must remain unpredictable to remain meaningful. They were the architects of the unfinished, the masters of the gap between the teeth. In the years that followed, Thrace watched as humanity began to use the builders' tools to reach beyond the edges of their own galaxy. They didn't build new rings. They built seed ships that carried the diverse DNA and cultures of their 1,000 worlds into the great voids between the clusters. They became a galactic gardener species, seeding the universe with the potential for chaos and the necessity of struggle. They encountered other civilizations, some young and violent, some old and tired, and they offered them not the final answer, but the right to keep looking. They became the friction that kept the cosmic gears turning, the noise that prevented the universe from falling into the silence of absolute order. Kalen Thrace passed away in his sleep while his ship was crossing the bridge between the Milky Way and Andromeda. He died as he had lived, in transit between 2 points, his work unfinished and his curiosity unsated. He was buried in the star stuff of the intergalactic void, his body broken down into the atoms that would one day form new stars and new worlds. In his hand, he still held the iron gear, a small piece of human defiance that had traveled further than any of its creators could have ever dreamed. The gear drifted away, a tiny, dark speck against the backdrop of 1 billion galaxies, a reminder that the weight of a feather, when backed by the will of a species that refuses to stop, is enough to move the universe. The story of humanity did not end with the builders, nor did it end with the conquest of the stars. It continued in every manual repair on a high-pressure world, in every new song sung by the forest children of Verdance, and in every debate that echoed through the halls of the Accord. They were the species that had looked at the end of the road and decided to take a detour. They were the survivors of the Great Filtration, the ones who had found that the only way to win the game of existence was to never stop playing. And as the light of 1 trillion stars reflected off the hulls of their diverse and beautiful ships, the universe itself seemed to lean in, listening to the messy, vibrant, and endlessly unfinished symphony of the human race.